escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Martin Connor. Number 21, Tim Kuzikowski, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. John Kuzikowski. Number 22, Mike Cerrone, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Angelo Cerrone. Number 23, Tommy Rosevich, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Tommy Rosevich. Number 24, Tony Graziani, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Christy Graziani. Number 25, Mark DeMichael, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Gabriel DeMichael. Number 29, Robert Bodigal, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Victor Bodigal. Number 30, Tim Delatorre, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Joseph Delatorre. Number 31, Anthony Lupinetti, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Anthony Lupinetti. Number 33, Curtis Bird, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. John Wilson. Number 34, Carlo Chrissy, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Michael Chrissy. Number 35, Dean DiBaradino, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Raymond DiBaradino. Number 40, Greg Lawrence. Number 41, John Lawrence, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Donald Lawrence. Number 42, Mike Allen, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Michael Allen. Number 43, Michael Benjamin, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Arthur Benjamin. Number 44, Steve Nance, escorted by Mr. Walter Nance. Number 50, Steve Donafee, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Steve Donafee. Number 51, Brian Pisciferato, escorted by Mr. Ronald Pisciferato. Number 52, Joe McGuire, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Patrick D. McGuire. Number 53, Mark Marchetta, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. James Marchetta. Number 54, Dave DeBeasy, escorted by Dr. and Mrs. Paul DeBeasy. Number 55, John Serafini, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. John Serafini. Number 61, Dave Owens, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. David Owens. Number 62, Richard Irosevich, escorted by Mrs. Anna Marie Irosevich. Number 63, Dave Massio, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. John Massio. Number 64, Frank Gianamore, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Frank Gianamore. Number 65, Angelo Lamatrice, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Angelo Lamatrice. Number 66, Todd Kosecki, and number 70, Ted Kosecki, escorted by Mrs. Margaret Kosecki. Number 67, Brian DeAndre, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Tony DeAndre. Number 68, Mark Delator, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Ron Delator. Number 71, Todd Phillipson, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Robert Phillipson. Number 72, Pat Pisciferato, escorted by Mr. Patrick Pisciferato and Mother Shirley Bird. Number 73, Joe Colabella, escorted by his mother, Mrs. Frances Colabella, and his brother, Tony Colabella. Number 74, Mark Taglione, escorted by his mother, Mrs. Barbara Taglione. Number 75, Sabatino DeMarzo, escorted by Miss Philomena DeMarzo. Number 77, John Sobolewski, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Joseph Sobolewski. Number 79, Mark DeTore and manager John DeTore, escorted by Mrs. Kathleen DeTore. Number 80, Mark Tripodi, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Vince Tripodi. Number 81, Jim Cavanaugh, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Charles Cavanaugh. Number 82, Tim O'Mara, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Timothy O'Mara. Number 83, Greg Peters, escorted by Mrs. Rita Peters. Number 84, Don Tiberio, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Dominic Tiberio. Number 85, Bill DiLeonardo, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. William DiLeonardo. Number 86, Lenny Turner, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Earl Turner. Number 87, Robert Vinberg, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Robert Vinberg. Number 88, Cliff Kiefer, and number 89, John Mintz, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Thomas Kiefer. And now our managers. Lisa Winter, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. George Winter. Kevin Feeney, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Tom Feeney. Keith Bodo, escorted by David and Phyllis Bodo. Reno Tarquinio, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Reno Tarquinio. Rich Gibson, escorted by Miss Angela Silviti. Now our varsity cheerleaders. Marie McGinnis, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Robert McGinnis. Melissa DeLuca, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Dominic DeLuca. Melissa Delfriendre, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. David Delfriendre. Jennifer Cimarella, escorted by Mr. Joseph Cimarella. Shelley Reed, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Richard Reed. Chris Deanabal, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Joseph Deanabal. Christy DeFallo, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Christine DeFallo. Our reserve cheerleaders, Monica Lamatrice, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Edward Lamatrice. Donna Herzog, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Andrew Herzog. Amy Sinclair, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Don Sinclair. Shonda Ignat, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Joseph Ignat. Lori Felder, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Frank Felder. Gina Corrigan, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. John Corrigan. Lisa Karpinski, escorted by Mr. and Mrs. Leo Karpinski.